The thing is, I don't know if I come, until I realized as old as it gets, it's recording. With this you really are sophisticated in architecture if you start to like that and you create. You think because then you mature, but it doesn't become an innovation or stuff. And so the funny thing is, I was never there. I was yesterday the first time there. I thought I know all night and I didn't even want to see. But once I was there, I suddenly understood why was this a close-moving project. And what we did, and this is what the whole series about, why can our people access the idea of the thing? And so when we went there, the reason is that if you look from the outside, it has nothing to do with what it looks from the inside. But what is clear is that if you want to understand this project, you have to understand everything of Frankfurt in order to understand why it looks like that. So the idea is that the architect hasn't designed the project. Who designed the project was actually the city. And so and I think it's totally wrong if you stand there and see this stupid corner, crappy, with these columns, because it makes no sense to understand the project. But once you are standing on that side, where we were standing yesterday, here, remember? And you would see the opposite building, where suddenly a sculpture comes out, then you would understand that this building is a reaction of that building next to it. And if this was basically a massive space, that pulled out from this facade, that became a negative one. And if you think about where does this stuff come from, then not because Holland had a genius idea, because he tried to assemble the essence of Frankfurt, of the idea of Frankfurt's architecture. Because you will see, if you go down to the Rathaus, you will see these arcades. But then you also could say, but why does the building have three parts? A roof, a middle part, and this. Because in principle, all Frankfurt buildings in the 19th century are based on the Renaissance villa, which has a ground, a middle part, and a roof. Now, why is that sandstone? Because the Pauluskirche is in sandstone, and if you turn your back around and you see the church, because the church is in sandstone, because Frankfurt is built on sandstone. And then if you ask yourself, but what is this stupid balcony doing here? But then if you go along the road, you would understand that that balcony has a relationship to the 19th century balcony of the bourgeoisie. And if you would understand, for example, let's say, that's another thing which we haven't figured out, but I'm sure if you look at this front, then you would find the front. Now, I would even argue that when we sold that one, I would even say there is a Venturi part of the project because these letters are too big, and it's more like a sign than a piece of letter. So what that whole building, and then of course there comes another idea, and I would say this gives the introduction to Rossi, because what you can see is the way how all these geometries are actually used are not in their original meaning. They are actually abstract geometries of primitive modernist primitives resembled in the meaning of the historical project. Which means if this was a column, then as you can see, it's not articulated as a column with a kind of monolithic head that means, let's say, Corinthian or Dorian or whatever. It then becomes basically a modular of architectural modernist primitives, like a cylinder, an arch, a cylinder, an arch. Now, why do you think I'm telling you this? The only reason why I'm telling you this is because the author of that architect is not Hollein, but is the idea of Frankfurt. Okay? So it's the essence. Another thing is, this is also probably a good one, why is it a triangle?
because it fills out. Oh, how did you know everything? Because Beatrice Colomina told you. Huh? See, Beatrice Colomina would have told you the kind of sexism of the window, yeah? And Mark Wrigley would tell you, no, no, this building doesn't exist. They're just a bunch of stupid cables and infrastructure. Yeah? Sorry. I become an architectural fundamentalist. Yeah? Yeah? I mean, and of course, as you can see, you see this little thing? That comes from here. Yeah? So all the symbolism to the outside is basically inherently, and so the triangle comes because, as you know, in the 19th century, you had the blocks, and the architecture was filled out the block. Yeah? So it means the block was a triangle, so it takes on the triangle. Now, I have no photo from the inside, but it's very beautiful. If you go then to the inside, you basically feel you're in a courtyard of a block, but only in an abstract one, yeah, because suddenly it becomes a void space in the entry. Yeah? So the idea is the building incorporates the idea of Frankfurt. Yeah? Now, and where does that guy has this from? And I would argue Hollein was, in principle, communicating with, you could say, Rossi, or with Italian architecture. And even when he wrote something about the idea of the absolute, yeah, and things like this, I think the core, or most of that stuff, lies in Aldo Rossi's work on the architecture of the city. Yep. So, what I mean by this is, once you understand that, you realize that Hollein was operating out of an ideology that was based in the mid-70s and 80s of post-war, which was a critique to modernism. Yeah? And I think if we can go on, and I think when we saw yesterday, the interior is then based on laws, yeah? Every room is different, yeah? And you could go on and on, but everything you see has a meaning to the history of architecture or to the history of the city itself. Yeah? Okay, now, why do I start this project? And perhaps because it is one of the, even when Eisenman wrote a book in 1963, yeah, on the idea of the formal principle of architecture, they never met, Rossi and Eisenman, but you could say Rossi wrote the principle of formalism in architecture in Europe. Yeah? And what does he mean by that? Now, here is an example. Now, I don't know, I go as long as I can, and if I'm too tired, I fall apart, you know, okay? But I just keep on going. So, I know it's only in German, I couldn't find that, yeah? But I just wanted to show you about the momentum in the 70s. And the idea was, the architect is actually dead, yeah? So if you look at this here, that is called the death of architecture, yeah? Which basically meant that in the 60s, yeah, so this book is a little bit late, but in the 60s, the idea was modernism was dead. Modernism is a dead body because what has happened is modernism, which was the idea of social architecture, the architecture without monument prefabrication, became the ideology of two postmodern ideas, and that was American corporate architecture, which means modernism moved suddenly into the corporate money, and in Europe it became the it became basically the excuse for large housing projects, yeah, monofunctional housing projects, yeah, and the project that basically was there, and I have it in a different lecture, is called from Ungers, the Märkische Viertel. I don't know, it's like 5,000 housing projects, yeah, where these people say we have to kill architecture, okay? And so in that mode, architect had to reinvent himself, and Rossi is the beginning of that reinvention as much as Eisenman in the US, but they have and Venturi. So what now, in principle, this idea was, is the following. This was a guy, why does it now work? I don't know. Now it's big again, I don't know. This was the teacher of Rossi. Now, does anyone know Does anyone know what you see? I would have been like I would like to be a teacher in the time of the 60s, yeah, and called Muratori. You know what I would ask you to do? It's really nice, eh? I would ask you to go into the archive of Frankfurt, okay? Find every plan, yeah, from 1000 to today, and then redraw it, okay? Redraw it, you know? All the walls, all the doors, all the walls. And then overlay them. From history to history, and then tell me which wall has shifted and which one stayed the same, yeah? And then go on and on until you tell me what is the essence of the plan that didn't change over history. Yeah? You have to imagine these guys were drawing like really slavery, like really architecture as a really slavery work of drawing, yeah? But the idea was, you see, my point is this: I just want to understand you that architecture has an idea, and if you don't have an idea, you just cannot do architecture. It's just that simple. So the idea was the following: if modernism had the idea to say, we invented the new, you know what I mean? There was nothing to represent, we revolutionized architecture, we made everything new, yeah? Then the Italians, as little old freaky historians, would say, well, you know, we from Rome, you know, who knows if there is not our architecture. So what these people were saying is, we go back to history and want to figure out, are these modernists really having done something new, or is the new not already in the past? Yeah. And so, for example, a little story to yesterday. Yeah. We were yesterday also at the socialist, housing project of the, how's it called? The Römerstadt, in 1925, Schütte-Lehotzky's new kitchen, yeah? And if you really drew, this was not new. The kitchen came from the countryside and was a kitchen that was already used by farmers, yeah? So what these Italians did is, they wanted to find out what is the permanence in time, yeah? And what is the idea that something stayed in history the same, and what really changed, yeah? And that is where the first time the idea of the type emerged, yeah? And that's why a lot of Italian researchers figured out, and this is later on proved by people like Anthony Fiedler and others, yeah, that were writing onto modernism, which were saying their typologies, meaning the kind of forms they were using, already comes from the 18th, 16th, 17th century, yeah? And if you once look exactly, and this is what, here you see, for example, what they did. So if this is Venice, how did Venice evolve, you see? And then they were mapping, 11th century, 12th, I mean, I'm just joking, yeah, but imagine 11, 12, 13, and then they would figure out, look, what always transforms is that the width is staying the same and space is only just expanded in depth and whatever. And so they wanted to understand what's the thing that is this, what stays the same and what things changed. And so that's what they did. Look, they were redrawing that stuff. In order to prove that modernism didn't invent something, modernism actually copied already something and just has modified it. Yeah? And so that's what is generally known, that you could argue that modernism didn't start with 1920s, but modernism already started in 1800 with the revolution, and that's why Ledoux becomes such an important point. And this is what Anthony Fiedler also later on wrote. And I think the guy that I'm referring to is a guy called Emil Kaufmann, who wrote a book on the beginning of autonomous architecture. And you could say, with classicism, the idea that the column moved out of the facade was the beginning that every architectural element became the same. Yeah? So that's the idea that modernism was already much later. So what now Rossi says, okay, what I am now trying to prove in my book is, and here it says very simple, the city is the subject of my book, but I want to understand the city as architecture, or basically And what he means by that is, by architecture, he doesn't mean that it's just the image of a city, the architecture makes the image, but he wanted to say it's actually architecture as a construction. And so the idea is, if I understand the city as architecture, I don't mean this architect as the city, I understand the city as a construction over time by projects, okay? So, what does it mean? It means basically that Rossi says, if I want to look into Frankfurt, or if I want to look into something, I'm not just seeing a form of an image, but what I see is ideologies, or call it zeitgeist, politics, who had an idea what the city should look like, was constructing the city by project on the project on the project on the projects, okay? Yeah? So if the Middle Ages made a wall, then the city had the idea of being a fortress. If the Middle Age made a grid, then there was an idea of capitalism. And if capitalism exploded and the city made the Siedlung, then socialism came. So what it is, the city is a layering of constructing of that subject. Okay? And so then he argues. So if in static extension and creation, basically there are two permanent characteristics of that architecture. Because architecture gives a concrete form of society, it means basically that in the form there's each time an idea of the society embedded. And that is what you could call, I would call the zeitgeist. Yeah? So if you do today a project, and I am asking, this is like my gang, shows me only a project from 30 years ago, you have two problems. Either you are nostalgic of the past, or you really understand the zeitgeist, which means it doesn't matter what we do, we're in a new form of eclecticism, anything can go. Yeah? You know what I mean? But you can only look at it from a zeitgeist manner. Now, why is that now important? And why is this a critique of modernism? Don't worry, you don't need to read it, I try to tell you. Because if you would go in a book of modernism, let's say Le Corbusier, Univers de Architecture, or City, he would say, you have to study the city first. I have to understand what is basically their economics, what is their social study. I'm arguing I have to study the content first, okay? I have to say everything about what I can say about the city, and that information goes, then I design the city, which basically becomes what he calls a generative functional system, Or I can understand it as a spatial structure, meaning I can understand it as a form, And this, you have to understand, is probably until today, the big difference, between any school of thought, any critic in front of you, if you make a form, the guy says, but what is the content? You didn't research enough, Then you research, then the other guy comes and says, but what does it have to do with your form? Basically, you're always wrong, You're just wrong. Now, the way out, there's only one way out, which I figured out, and that is, coincidentally, I think, Graham Harman, who said once to me, there is every form, every content comes in a form, but no form can come, no content can come without a form. So that means, if you study content, you still have a problem, you have to bring it into form. But every form has an embedded content in themselves, So you cannot come from content to form, because content always comes in a form, So that's why, well, don't worry, this is my excuse, I saved myself. And I tell you very simple, because why? I wanted to believe the first point, okay? Now the first point looked like this. I studied everything. Philosophy, I had a girlfriend who studied biology, she told me about the birds in the city, You know what I mean? Then I had a historian, I learned a lot by women, Then I had a historian girlfriend, and she, just joking. But imagine now you have millions of these friends, everyone tells you, come from a different discipline, everyone tells you, oh, the city is a new biospecies for particular animals. No, the city is an economical environment generating money. No, the city is real society in comparison to community. Of course, everyone studies the city, but one thing is clear, everyone studies the city from their viewpoint of looking to the city out of their discipline. Now, if you say I'm a psychologist, like Freud, and I would say Vienna is responsible for the idiots, which I think is true, then of course Freud doesn't say, I'm going to save your brain because I'm going to make a good architecture for you. Freud would not, Freud would be, he would shoot himself to be as arrogant and thinking psychology can be answered, by him making an architecture. But we architects think like this, we can solve psychology by making good architecture. We are really, either we are the absolutely idiots, or we are the genius of the world. The problem is we behave as the genius because we don't know. That's the dilettante, the absolutely crazy. So that's why, for example, Rossi says the only thing that I can really say is I can say that within my discipline, architecture, there is an architecture, but probably its content is constructed out of a particular meaning, but I cannot come to the form by studying everything else. No, I can only start with the form, and I can see if there is an embedded content that drives it. And that's why I think this, I just want to explain to you, and this is my real honesty, if you like animals, go and study sociology. If you like people brains, go and study psychology. You know what I mean? Because architecture cannot do it. Architecture can just stupidly stand in front of a Holland building and say, what does it look like? This looks like here. It's not, there is no deeper thing. I have a friend. I give you a really interesting example of a friend. I have a friend. She is studying. She's a psychologist. And she does what she calls. I forgot the methodology. I think it's called Tiefenhermeneutik. It's called deep hermeneutics. Now, what her argument is if I take an object, that's her idea, if I take the object, let's say a building, she is doing it on a building, and I read all the stories of the building, you know what I mean? What is the interview, what is someone writing where, I can figure out, basically a psychological essence, that is embedded within the society through the building, you know what I mean? So she uses the building, as basically an application of her own Tiefenhermeneutik, or depth, I think it's called depth hermeneutics, for her own discipline. But she would get shot, if she would say, I'm going to design now for my final project a building. No, because she only can bring her knowledge back to her own discipline. You know what I mean? And I think this is only what I just want to say, and that's why if you really want to mean something, stay with stupid, boring architecture. That's my recommendation. At least, as my Iranian friend said, I'm just an old-fashioned guy. But of course, you realize we don't need a lot of architects anyhow. Okay, so. Now what Rossi does, and this is very simple, he analyzes the city now and gives in this book 4 chapters, which I think is interesting, and is, if people know Rossi, if you once know it, then you can see this is the way how people that like Rossi really analyze it, and if you want to understand the work of Pier Vittorio Aureli and Togma and others, then it's basically. So the first thing is, there's a definition of what is typology. The next thing is, how do I now understand the form of the city, or which he calls, what are the different elements which constitutes the city? Now, these are the idea of the projects. what does it have to do with the idea of the locus? And here comes, all of this project come with a political choice. So politic as a choice, yeah? So which means there is an ideology, yeah, to which you think. So I'll give you a very stupid example. If you go to Karlsruhe, have you been in Karlsruhe? Yeah? And Emperor, I don't know, Charles, or how the guy called, yeah, says, all the city from the Middle Age have to go on one street to my little super castle, yeah? And all the ways have to meet my castle. He basically wants to say, I am representing the center of the world because I am the power. Yeah? Yeah? So it looks like, because it represents basically power. So there's a politics in that, because it means something why the form looks like that. So what Rossi, let's go to the first one. So Rossi says, in principle, and this is where he becomes interested, is he became interested in not only the projects that have been built, but also the projects that have been projected onto the city. Yeah? So this is a very famous example. He always uses it, and these are, I hope I'm right, are 3 buildings of Palladio in Venice. Yeah? But the interesting thing is, none of these 3 buildings ever have been there like that. This is not a representation of real Venice. What it actually is it's 3 buildings. One has been built, one has only been planned as a drawing, and one, I think, I don't even know, but I only know the one has been built, the other one is the bridge, the Ponte Vecchio. But what he wanted to show is that in the city, you only not have the idea of what is present, but also what is absent of the city, yeah? And that what is absent of the city has also an idea of the city, or basically is incorporated as an idea in other projects, okay? So what you can see is that buildings are there of a different time, but buildings are also there as being built or as being only drawn, yeah? Or, for example, a structure of the building is, for example, what you could call the grid or the first layout. You know, if you look at cities that have a particular grid, that is what is constituting the element. Yeah? Or, for example, something like in Spain, a city that is based on biliogram has grown over history. So there is the idea that the city looks like, yeah, as basically it structures over time. So let's go about into the introduction of some of them. So individual artifact. So this is the first image in the book, and what here comes the main critique to modernism on the example of the Palazzo della Ragione in Padua. What Rossi tries to describe there is that in this palazzo, what you actually can see is it has taken on multiple different functions over time. It was a palazzo, yeah? Then it became empty, then it became a marketplace. Now I don't know what it is. So what he argues is, even when this palazzo was always there, by the change of its function, incorporated each time an activity of the city, yeah? But what really made it to a building was not the function, but what actually the building. Its form that was constantly adaptable. Yeah? And so here you see, for example, the way it is placed. For example, the shops have changed, the function have changed, the gallery has changed, and so on. And so here, this is what Rossi wants to argue. If you look at them in the beginning, what always stayed permanent was basically the structure of the building. Meaning, it had a wall, it had a corridor, it had a series of spaces, yeah? It had a topology of a plan, or you could, yeah? It had an organization, but it had a particular form of which all the other program became permanent. So here you can see, you know, it basically had rooms over rooms, it had an arcade, and then it had the extension of rooms. So that layer of form, so form in that sense is not only something how it looks like, but form is also the idea, or I would call the topology of a plan, which means the relationship of the rooms to each other. Yeah? So So when he argues then this, is that I'm not only interested, is the form, but or why I'm interested in the form is because it is a summary, of all the architects, including its origin. Meaning, when I see that form, it's not only that what I see today, it's also the history that made it to become that form, or basically from the origin to its artifact. So why is that? Because you see, you can build out of different things, you can make out of different things, But what he became really interested is in the idea of the courtyard. This is one of the examples that he wanted to show. He says we can find the courtyard in any culture. We can find it in every political system. We can find it in different economical environments. But what we see is that there is an origin, or there is a form that is permanent, but then we have something that is not permanent, and that is its multiple application. And so why I'm arguing this is because here you can see it can be used as a plan for the Greek house, it became used for a Roman house, it was a plan for a marketplace in Verona, and so on, and it can go on, and it became a housing project, it became a castle, and whatever. But what it really wanted to say is that architecture has an idea which he calls a type, and his definition for his typology is used by a guy from the 18th century. Is called Quatremer de Coissin, this one, French guy, who basically made a distinction between the idea of the type versus the idea of the model, okay? So, the word types for Quatremer means it represents not so much the image of a thing to be copied or perfectly imitated as the idea of an element that must itself serve as the rule for a model. So typology is the rule for which I can make 1,000 applications. Just know, if you go in your little grasshopper, making a little super Cody, and then you see shapes jumping out, you know what I mean? Don't think you have done something really geniusly perfect. You just made a code, which is a type that has multiple models of output. So the idea that there is something like an origin and there's something that is multiple output is this idea. And so the model is understood and this is where he takes his fun, because he was dealing with art history. It was the idea for him of the idea of the mold. So if I do, for example, a brick, the mold of the brick is my type, but the brick, the kind of pouring the thing in, terracotta, the millions of thousands of bricks, they are basically, you could say, the models that come out. That's why, for example, when the computer came, there was also an interesting shift in the Leucian idea, or that is what Sanford Winter and others were saying, or there was this guy, Gilbert Simondon, who would argue there is a reverse idea as well, because when I pour matter in, it also has an effect on the mold, and this become all this idea that there's because they call it a hylomorphic model, there is a form called table, and I put matter into the table, but there came all this idea as a critique on that, perhaps there is only a particular form in wood, or there's a formness in matter that didn't know, just know. Okay? So, what Rossi now shows is that this kind of idea I can apply onto architecture by the idea of the courtyard, because what is the courtyard as a type, it's nothing else as an outside space inside architecture, but then I can apply it in millions of thousands ways, blah, 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 and of course, and this is why he likes Vienna, because even Vienna used it. And why? And this is exactly my example that I always give to you most of the time, because I always argue that Viennese have never been modern, which meant the idea was not in the 1920s, I construct a new housing and according to Le Corbusier's new manufacturing, yeah, or what we saw yesterday with Ernst May in the modular articulation of houses based on the repetition of the same. Now, what did the Austrians do? You know, our farmers should, our workers should also live like the emperor. What did the emperor do? He made great castles, yeah? So, let's put the form of a castle, yeah? And that's why you had these gigantic social housing projects, but their form was actually a form taken from history, yeah? And was actually the courtyard, yeah? Which was used not only for single-family houses, but for castles, for hospitals, and so on. So this is why Rossi became interested. It was using a form, but at the same time, it was a political act, because in order to apply that form, in order to do a building that is 1,000 meters, you know what I have to do? I have to get in power. I have to get in power, basically, because I have to buy all the land and execute that and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So, that I think is an interesting thing. He made also some interesting classifications. For example, how can I understand the city in relationship to that? And how would I understand the idea of a street, a district, and a city? Okay? And I think this is one of the most beautiful descriptions that I'm using for a long time, and that is, he made the idea, what would be a formalism based on the content of property, okay? So if ownership, yeah, or real estate, yeah, was always part of the construction of the city, what would be a typological understanding, yeah? And so he made, on the scale of the street, the idea that in real estate, you had basically, you could say, 4 types. A block of houses surrounded by open space. Now that's clear. You have just a house and space is surrounded. This is basically the single-family house that we know. Yeah? It basically occurs sometimes within, you could say villas, or you can also say within capitalist entity, where you can just put a house onto a piece of land. Yeah? Or a block of a house connected to each other, facing the street, constituting a continuous wall. That's, for example, a 19th century house that you find, yeah, which is basically the house based on capitalism next to each other. Then the deep block, yeah, which is totally occupied, and that is, you could say, the house that basically occupies the whole amount of real estate. That's factories, that's the courtyard house, and so on. Or the houses with a closed courtyard with an inner structure, yeah? So, but interesting enough, if you look at them, you can each time argue a different political idea to the typology of land versus building. And here he says the pre-capitalist house, in the social economic thing. Then the capitalist house, the para-capitalist house, and the socialist house. So in each of these ideas, you can see that when he looked into the type, he classified them in such a way that you might understand that different real estate produces different kind of types of buildings. So, and here comes the definition of the urban artifact, and I think this is the summary which he uses, but he uses, instead of the word type and model, for the city, he uses the word typology and morphology. Yeah? So, for example, if someone asks you, study typology, then you would say, oh, I do a 50 square meter house. Just to understand, that typology that Rossi is using has nothing to do with the classification of modernism. There was a guy to which this is all a reaction, I think a German or also an Austrian, I don't know, is called Befsner, and Befsner, who did a historical, the first historical book on buildings, or one of them, one classification, he would classify houses, museums, office, he would classify them according to function. Yeah? But for Rossi, a classification of typology is what is constituting continuous in time. And what he calls in the model, in Quattromere Sinn, is in his case the idea of the morphology, which is that's the city, that's the application, that's the idea how the thing continues in space, because in morphology it always becomes applied differently, yeah? Because even when the type is a courtyard, you know, I can have in the continuity of the time of a city each time different courtyards, you know? Okay? And so then, that is what then goes then in relationship to this idea, what he calls the permanence, yeah? And in the permanence, I mean not only one can still experience the form of the past, yeah, in this monument, but that the physical form of the past has assumed different functions and has continued to function, conditioning the urban area in which it stands and continuing to constitute an important urban focus. So here comes the conclusion. So what is permanent is its form, but what is not permanent is its function. Yeah? He doesn't talk about he doesn't talk about dead objects or ruin. I mean, he doesn't talk about ruins. He still believes it's because what he wants is he wants to find forms that are still activate as urban artifacts today. Now, one of the most beautiful examples that I think for kit bashing fans, yeah. So just know if you want to be a kit bash fan, yeah, then you should know Rossi is good for kit bashing as well. And I think it's one of the most examples. This was a very famous idea. I don't know if you know, the Spanish, you know, were actually Muslims. Yeah, yeah. I don't know how long, until 1000 or something. Quite long, quite long. I have to check on it. But then some weird Christians figured out we might have to get rid of, and we have to push them back. Yeah, and so there were a lot of mosques, yeah, more or less in Spain. But then the question was, then the Catholics came, yeah, and they wanted to make a church. So the problem was, how do I make a church? I have two choices. I can get rid of the moschee, which would mean I get rid of the history of the moschee. Or I can put a moschee, a church, into the structure of the moschee. Yeah? And that's actually this very famous example. So once the moschee was built and the Christians came and wanted to build basically a church, I mean, this is the unification, you know, this is like the form overcomes politics of religion. Yeah? Basically what they did is they took the structure, and this is what you can see, this was the structure of the moschee, and what you can see is the church was taking on the structure of the grid, yeah? And was building then the church onto the thing of the moschee. Yeah? This is the most famous thing. So this is kit bashing, yeah? Moschee goes together. Yeah? But the interesting thing, as you can see, in order to unify them, yeah, something stayed permanent over time in order for the other thing to change. Yeah? Similar goes, for example, to the Alhambra. And so you can say what then he became interested is when the one part of his idea was the idea of this artifact and the typology, then the other thing was about the idea of the elements and the concept of area. Yeah? So, for example, why I mean, it's a little part that I'm showing you is because you will see once you when we come to the book to the part of Ungers, you remember the project of the archipelago, yeah? You would understand that only once Rossi wrote, yeah, that the idea is the artifact or something that has homogeneous capacity, yeah, then basically you would understand Ungers, because what Ungers says is you can delete all Berlin, but what has to stay is that little archipelagos that are basically examples of these kind of forms and types that have the capacity to change. Yeah? So the area, so when the first one was more the artifact, the next thing that he was interested is the idea of the area. And for him, an area, more or less, is actually the street system. Yeah? So he became very fascinated in the way that if you once lay out the street, you lay out, you could say, the field. Now, just to know, guys, today, you remember figure and field? primitive element, grid city. You know, it's in principle are the two formal principles. One is understood as a field related to like a mesh, like a grid, and the other one is a singular figurative object, meaning the artifact. Yeah? So if you would understand now this idea, of course, with Rossi, and here you can say why he is interested in these two things. Rossi was not only interested, he was less interested in this housing, he was interested in that what constitutes the collective memory of the city, meaning that's where the public is, and that's why it's the street grid and the singular object that changes in function. Yeah? So that's where he became interested in that. Now, here comes the idea. So he was less interested, and this was his critique, on some of this understanding of, you have to imagine, this would be a study of the 20s, yeah, where you make a functionally study, yeah, of a city based on where's the park, where's the industrial area, but it goes even more, it goes racist, yeah, where the Germans, where the Swedish, yeah. If you know a plan, there's a really interesting plan analyzed by a feminist from very famous plan from Eco Shah in Casablanca, yeah, which was a kind of modernist project, yeah, where suddenly here living the Muslims and here the Europeans, yeah, where basically in the plan there will be a racism. Now, of course, he doesn't want to go in this functional category because he was interested more or less in the understanding of the continuous morphological structure, yeah. So that means he was interested in how basically the various histories are building on the city. And this is Frankfurt, and I think we showed it, or this is when I show you my, did I show you my 4 different diagrams? The circle, the grid, the archipelago, and the solid? Okay, anyhow. Because you could see what he does is, it's here the Middle Age city with its political thing, then this is the city of the defense mechanism, then this is the city of the 19th century, it's the grid, and then the modernist city are the archipelagos out there, and then the city as a solid, I don't know, is the European bank, you know, or something like, or a shopping mall. So what you can see is, it basically becomes a layer of history in time. Or, for example, here, plan of Vienna, you know, with the river, the mountains, the ring. So just to know, all these kind of rings were basically rings that were dealing with defense, yeah, had all a permanent historical time. So, for example, if Rossi would design Berlin, yeah, after 1989, yeah, he would never destroy the wall. Because he would say that is a political act to which the city has a collective memory. So it might not be that the wall is there, but he would ever have kept that thing empty. Yeah? Or this is what Kohlhaas work in a certain way is about. Now, then he goes also, for example, in some of this housing stuff, yeah. And that's where, for example, you can see that, and this is what is interesting in the 19th century, that a piece of land in relationship to the house go always together. What is in Berlin really interesting, and it's a very, very fascinating place. In every other European city, as you can see, you had a piece of land and then you had a piece of building. Yeah, so that became the form of the idea of the capitalist and then its housing projects. Yeah? But what you can see is that changed always, because Paris looks slightly different than Berlin looks slightly different in Vienna. And why? Because in each of the city there was a different historical typology that slightly had different variations. So, for example, even when you think about, if you go in the northern European part, which you have single-family houses standing next to each other, it's a different than the Catholic part, where I always have a collective housing project. Yeah? So historically, there's a different type, yeah, that then constitutes the same diagram. So, for example, here you can see the pieces of land, the building on it, and the 19th century housing project. But if you look at this, it has a lot to do with Schinkel's idea of the villa in a landscape. Yeah. So what Rossi wants to argue, even when it is completely differently embedded, you know, in the idea of the 19th century idea of the city, its idea comes from Schinkel villa. And if you go further with Ungers in the archipelago, yeah, would make a city, but the idea comes also from Schinkel's understanding of Charlottenburg in the landscape. Yeah? So what Rossi wants to show is also ideas, not only buildings, can mutate over time and become each time a different form. Okay? That's why I show you now this in Rotterdam. You see, if this one was Berlin, was a 19th century Berlin mass house, yeah, with these kind of blocks. You see, one block is basically 20 meters. So if you look at them, they're like 20 meters by 30 meters. But if you go back to the Netherlands, it's basically only 4.50 meters by 20, because the typology historically was single-family houses. Yeah? And so that's where the type comes in the morphology of the city. And this is why my argument is always that I tell you, it's not the norm that comes first. It's architecture that comes first, and then it forces a norm. Okay. Also, this is for example the Siedlung of Berlin by Sharon. And if you look at the 50s in Sharon, you could see this idea of modernist slabs in the middle of a large landscape was actually the idea of Charlottenburg, yeah, making houses in the middle of landscape. And that's why Sharon has a word for that, which is called he calls it. The city landscape, yeah, it was the idea of a landscape with individual buildings in it. So here, Hofsteinsiedlung, yeah. So the last thing, and this is, I think, what I already argued, is there's one interesting idea that Rossi argues, and that is the idea of the monument. Yeah. Now, why he becomes interested in the primary elements are not only monuments, just as they are not only fixed activities in those, but they also have the capability of accelerating the process. Now, why he is interested in this kind of stuff is the monument is for him a collective memory. Yeah? So if I see a building, or it's not, if I see a building, in the building, yeah, it is a monument. I don't know if you know, they understand. Do you remember you know this image? And we are going to see the lecture 4 about Venturi when he has this box and it says, "I am a monument." Remember, there's this decorated shed. You know, where you have a shed and it says, "I am a monument." Yeah, because what in principle Venturi said, very similar to what Rossi said, that the building is not just a building. In its representation and in the way it is a layer of history, it is a collection of memory. That's why people shoot temples, yeah? Because what they shoot is not the building, they shoot the collective memory of the building. That's why you would understand destruction. Why, if you want to do a revolution, the first thing is you have to kill the palace, yeah? You don't need to kill Ceausescu, you have to kill basically his palace, because in the architecture is the representation of communism. You know what I mean? That's why that's why you see always in the revolution you get the monument down. Yeah, you know, it's an interesting story, because what you want to do is, it's not about the object, it's about the memory that is related to this object. Yeah? And that's what. But why it's interesting for Rossi, because he argues, and this is what comes in the book of the cities, because he says in this collective memory there is also a generation of the city, yeah, or you can say the in object. So, for example, if you want to buy today real estate in Los Angeles, then I can recommend you now, buy there where a collective memory comes in, because then the land value around increases. So, for example, this is where the new stadium of the NFL is going to be built. So what's happening, of course, with this one building, which is collective money and so on, what happens is it generates, of course, an urban fabric. Yeah? And that's, I think, what is the idea of the monument as an accelerator of urbanization. Now, he gives some examples, yeah, what he means by that. And I think for my kid bashing fans, you know, Fantastic, yeah? So here, and I have to change something because I don't know which slide comes next, so I'm a little bit confused. Anyhow, this is an interesting area of how it looked like after the Romans were nearly dead, yeah? Here you can see, for example, what happened to Roman objects. Now, this was, for example, a theater, yeah? And as the Roman emperor evaporated, yeah, basically you could also say the theater more or less declined. Yeah? But what was interesting is that these theaters that were once then becoming empty, they had such an interesting form, or kind of fortressification, yeah, that of course in the ages were, I always think between 300 to 1100, yeah, which is called the Dark Ages, we were just hunting around with a cross, and shooting everywhere. You know, it's like 700. Sorry? Yeah, because Byzantium was too, because culture moved down to Serbia. Yeah. Yeah, because you got the Diocletian palace around 600 or something. Yeah. Everything. Yeah, but the rest was just just Jesus. You know. Anyhow. So of course, since everything vanished, yeah, the interesting thing is this, and this is what Rossi wants to show, is that these forms have the capacity to generate a city. And so in this forum, especially the ones, the amphitheater, they turned that in the Middle Ages as the structure of a city. Yeah. So this is this famous example where basically you can see still the form. Yeah. Yeah. Now, just to know, if you wanted to be a good postmodern architect like Rob Greer, yeah, in the 1980s, or that's what Holland also did, yeah, what you do is you go, you make a new competition, yeah, you have no idea. What you do is you go in the library, find an old plan from the 15th century. Oh, that's how it looks. Just know, if you go to Vienna, do you know the Haas house? Haas house? Okay, it has a curve, okay? And usually you think, why should it have a curve? Because it can have it's the end of the block. But Holland found the old plan in the Middle Age. There was a curved building, yeah, and that's how it justified it out. So just to know, why I'm showing you this kind of postmodern era is because for me it is important to give you an understanding that is, and this is what the whole lecture series is about, is the shift of becoming a different author, not anymore you becoming the subject of knowing what the world should look like, yeah? But basically the history and the city became the subject of what it looks like. Or, in my understanding, the audience, yeah? And in that sense, the audience is the city. So the only reason why I do this lecture series is to show you, yeah, that the city was the audience of the constitution of that architecture. Yeah? So there was always something before. So that's why Holland did this curved building, yeah? And I think the reason why Holland, I think, is one of the best postmodernists is because literally he just copied what was around him. Yeah? Okay. I like this one, huh? You see, when here were the lions, you know, suddenly it was housing. Yeah, and here was Gladiator coming out, and this became then, I don't know, shopping street, yeah, or something, yeah. You know, I mean, if you see this, you realize functionalism is stupid. Yeah, because you can make out of everything something. I think this is what I really, I will never forget when Kipnis once said, I mean, the best definition to Kipnis towards functionalism is, he didn't say in front of a cave, yeah, this is a 2-room apartment. We just occupied the cave. Yeah? That's why I think the human species is a reflexive subject. Yeah, it can reflect onto what it's given to him. Here another one. Yeah, in Nîmes. You see, it's interesting how suddenly. So here where Caligula, yeah, and you don't know, and how the king, you know, were driving their horses. You know, it became suddenly a kind of a inner city space, and that's a nice one. So just to know, this form then, of course, later on, not only became part of the Middle Age city, it became also the part of, let's say, the Colosseum and the kind of new collective space in classicism, yeah? Like, for example, Bollé, Ledoux's large spaces, you know, and here, for example, the Colosseum in Rome, yeah? Or here, for example, Pope VI's transformation of the Colosseum into a wool factory, yeah? So in the 19th century, the Colosseum of Rome became a wool factory, yeah? Now, this is another thing, we will come to this is the idea of the locus. We will talk on this because there's a similar relationship to the phenomenologist, yeah, that we're going to see with, Okay, so the last part actually, and this is the part that Rossi calls the evolution of the urban artifact. This is where he becomes interested in basically arguing what are the forces of doing that, yeah? And the two, and here you can see that even when he not literally talks about them, but what the form articulates is the forces to which these forms, of course, are merging, yeah? And this is basically the idea of land ownership and so on. And one of the most interesting theses that I discovered was this kind of Hauptwachs, who basically made this idea of the collective memory stuff. Yeah? But what is the most important thing, and that is why you have to understand it, is it's a politics as choice, meaning that in all of these acts, there has to be a political decision, or within that work, there's a political decision or collective decision embedded. Yeah? And I think this is the importance that people, for example, that study Rossi, is the content, and what I mean by the politics, it's the content, yeah, to which these projects are driven, yeah? So, this is, just one interesting force of economics is, for example, the 19th century houses. You can only understand them once you understand that actually the land price was higher and higher, and the buildings basically become nothing else as the occupation of the high land price. So that's why you have to understand the high-rise building. When I think, I don't know if I told you, the high-rise building is not a modernist intervention, it's an intervention of the city. Because without enormously high real estate, the high-rise would not emerge. So the high-rise is in principle a product of the city, rather than a product of an architect. Yeah? Here, for example, Barcelona, yeah? Here you can see this is what then Barcelona did, which I think is an important point. For example, here you can see this was the Middle Age of Barcelona, and this was basically the grid. Now, what really the grid is about, if you think about this, the grid is about ordering capital. Yeah? Of course, it was about finding circulation, finding a nice thing, but in principle, what it was about is that the capital city, yeah, should be organized, yeah. And so what he did is he made the subdivision of land in which land becomes. See, this was the beginning of Serra's idea, which is a totally socialist idea, because I would need the whole piece of land to do 2 slabs. But in principle, it became the organism of capitalism, because capitalism means I have a property, I need a commodity, and only if I have an identified object, I can have it as a commodity and then sell it. Yeah? Okay. That's an interesting also story, which is land ownership. He's arguing that there is not only a layer of history always in every city, there is also a layer, or you could also see there is an evolution of the construction of the city that goes from wilderness to agriculture to the city. And so a lot of the kind of structures that you can find in the cities, and I think a very nice example is one example in Amsterdam, which is called the Jordaan. If you look at it in the plan, and because I'm living there, it has a totally different scale, yeah? It's totally different in terms of directionality, because this was an agricultural land layout, yeah? And once it was agriculturally layouted, yeah, it turned then into a city fabric. So there is agriculture in the base. So this is an example, for example, out of Basel from Bernoulli, and Bernoulli was arguing if this was the subdivision, basically, of the land before, then you could see that it slightly turned into an urban territory, so you can see slightly also the buildings in there, and then it turned into buildings. Now, interesting thing enough, in Barcelona, where you would put down a grid, the grid was really going over the agricultural land. But I don't know if someone comes from Mexico City or in Vienna, you always, I don't know how they were called in Mexico cities, but there were pieces, ranchos, or large pieces of lands, yeah, and they each time became then a grid. And so if you look then into a city of Vienna, you see patterns, collages of grids, because each time there was a different agricultural territory behind it. Now, and so what in principle now as an end, he argues, yeah, that what you see in Athens, what you see in Rome, what you see in Paris, yeah, what you could see in Tehran or see in China, Shanghai, whatever, every architecture or every city, yeah, is in that sense a form of their politics, yeah, because that politics is always a sign of a collective will. Yeah? And so what Rossi then means is, if in architecture there is no collective will, then there is also no architecture. Yeah? And so here comes the whole point that an individual house is never in his terms architecture. Architecture is then when it resembles something that is larger, yeah, or belongs to a collective. And that's why you will find then in the history many of the examples that building is not architecture, yeah, but architecture represents an idea. But the question is, which idea? Not only a disciplinary one, always an idea of the collective, yeah, or of the will to which is collective, yeah. And that's basically the idea of Rossi, yeah. And I hope I could give you a kind of insight. And the only thing what I want you to remember from Rossi is the understanding, I think, which is important, is what is a type in relationship to what is a morph, what is permanence in time. And the other thing is that architecture is, a city is a construction, yeah, of projects that each time articulates a political will, yeah? And in that political will, you can see the city as a constitution of that. With these guys, I'm very sorry, my energy is a little bit down, but what is happening is we're not going to meet us next month, Monday in a week, yeah, but we're going to meet us Wednesday, not the coming week, but Wednesday in 1 week. Yeah? Okay? Thanks, guys. All the best. This was once, yeah? Yeah? And then it became a village. Oh, yeah.